We have a fantastic group with us. Joyce Vance, former U.S. attorney and professor at the University of Alabama School of Law. Matt Miller, former chief spokesperson for the Justice Department under President Obama. Basil Smikle, a Democratic strategist and former executive director of the New York State Democratic Party. And Matt Gorman, Republican strategist and former communications director for the NRCC. Joyce, to you first, what do Democrats need to do to get Robert Mueller to reset the narrative? He doesn't want to.
Democrats have a very careful needle threading job that they need to do Wednesday morning. Stephanie, I think what they can do most importantly is help Americans understand the connection between Volume 1 of the report and Volume 2. Because in Volume 2, Mueller lays out 10 areas of potential obstruction. Legal experts have said that they believe between 3 and 5 of those are indictable. But obstruction never happens in a vacuum. And here it happens in the context of the Volume 1 discussion of collusion and cooperation between the campaign and Russia. Democrats should try to get Mueller to focus on his inability to fully develop evidence. He says he didn't have sufficient evidence to indict a conspiracy, but he says that in many ways that's because witnesses were unavailable, or they lied, or evidence was destroyed. And if Democrats can hammer that point home with the public, they may be able to make some of the inroads that they need to make in this hearing.
Mr. Miller, one issue that was not explored in the report was Robert Mueller's interactions with the new Attorney General, Bill Barr. And we know they didn't agree with how Bill Barr summarized the report. Is that an area where Democrats could get the most bang for their buck?
I think it absolutely is. I've looked at two big areas I think are important to try to question the special counsel on. One are to elicit the answer to the question: did the if the president wasn't a sitting president, would he be indicted? I don't think he'll answer it directly, but there are ways to kind of back into it. And I think the second is to try to show how the Attorney General misled the public about his report. I don't think if you ask Mueller directly, do you disagree with the way Barr has handled it? I don't think he'll answer that question in the affirmative, but I do think there are ways to ask him short, factual questions. For example, is it true that your investigation confirmed that there was no collusion, which is a statement the Attorney General made at his press conference? The answer to that question will be no. I think you can also ask him, is it true that, as the President has said, that your report found no obstruction of justice? We know the answer to that question is no, because the report said so. So I think if you frame the questions to him as, do you disagree with the Attorney General, you're not going to get a direct answer. However, if you just read some of the more aggressive statements the Attorney General has made, many of which are directly contradicted by the special counsel's report, I think some of the yes or no answers from the special counsel that directly contradict what the Attorney General said can be very politically damaging.
Basil, Michael Conway was congressional counsel during the Nixon impeachment, and he wrote this about Mueller's testimony. The questioning by Democrats, and more importantly by Republican members, may create a spectacle that could undermine Mueller's credibility with the public and therefore his report. Could Democrats actually hurt their own case here?
It's possible that both sides could, quite frankly, because I'm not an attorney, but he seems to be a reluctant witness, and therefore in the absence of a lot of information that he might provide, both parties are going to be projecting their own desired outcomes on him. So I think for Democrats, and I think Joyce is absolutely right with this, what Democrats need to do is get him to provide just enough information that they can hone their narrative. I don't think that this in and of itself is do or die, but what is do or die is if Democrats don't actually form that narrative that our candidates can use throughout the remainder of this cycle. And I would also, I would say this, Jerry Nadler, for example, who had been very cautious in his conversation about whether or not we should start impeachment hearings, has leaned into it a little bit more over the last few days. And he's actually getting a primary from a challenger that wants Democrats to go further into this impeachment and actually start these hearings. And my concern is whether or not if some Democrats take their time and try to create this case, that they're not going to do it quickly enough to stave off some of these challenges, because that actually would be a lot more divisive for us than us making sort of a credible case over time.
Mr. Gorman, I too am not a lawyer, but I am an enthusiast of Law and Order SVU. So I like to consider myself a law
Expert,
Amateur, yes. Republicans, how are they going to play this? Does it make more sense for them to go hard on the deep state, pushing on the origins of the investigation, Comey, Strzok, Lisa Page, what the president likes to do? Or do they go easy, knowing, as Basil put it, that Mueller is a reluctant witness, and he's most likely not going to give Democrats something new?
From what I hear, the Republicans want to do a little bit of a lighter touch, because in many ways...
I've seen a lot of Republican light touch.
Light touch,
yeah.
you know. But there are going to be some outliers, certainly. There's going to be a lot of topics, I'm sure, that you just mentioned. For the most part, the ranking member of the committee and others are going to do a little bit of a lighter touch. And remember, in many ways, the Mueller report came out okay for the Republicans. And so if they undermine Mueller's credibility, they're really just defeating themselves. And to Basil's point, too, he's done this 88 times before, Robert Mueller, testifying in front of Congress.
88.
88 times before. So this isn't something that he's going to do lightly, and he's probably not going to make a lot of mistakes. So what's very important, as Basil said, that neither side overreach. And when it comes to impeachment, I think the biggest thing for Democrats coming out of this, it'll give them cover to call for impeachment. That whatever, they'll pull something from the hearing and give that as an excuse to call for impeachment. I would watch that in the coming days as well.
And I'm sorry, if I could just add very quickly, one of the things that I really do want to come out that we can act on is election security. Because we're not talking as much about that, but it is probably the most pressing issue outside
First paragraph of the report,
that's right.
Sweeping and systematic
That's
interference.
Right. That's
Good
right.
point. Joyce, I want to share what the president said about Robert Mueller when the president was asked about Mueller testifying. It was just a week ago.
No, I don't. As far as I'm concerned, they already took their impeachment vote, and the impeachment vote was so lopsided. It was a massive victory. And you know what? At some point, they have to stop playing games, because they're just playing games. No, I won't be watching Mueller.
Joyce, what's it going to take to convince the American people that this issue is worth digging back into? For many people, they think this thing was decided a month ago, even though they might not realize all that's in it.
There are two things that are important. The first will be to move people off of the original summary that they heard from the Attorney General, that there was no collusion and no obstruction. Mueller's testimony will likely clarify that. The question will be whether people are listening and hear the message. And then secondarily, it's important for people to understand that a criminal investigation is different from an impeachment hearing. Criminal investigations look solely at very specific federal statutes. Mueller chose, for a number of reasons, not to indict the president. But it'll be important for people to learn on Wednesday that what happens in impeachment is very different, and that a clean bill of health for a criminal investigation doesn't mean that high crimes and misdemeanors weren't committed by this president.
Mr. Miller, let's go back to Jerry Nadler. He said over the weekend that he is finally going to court to enforce the subpoena for Don McGahn, former chief White House counsel. Does that in any way change the narrative around impeachment? Or does one say, why are you finally getting to it now? The president is trying to run the clock. And if that's his goal, he's sort of achieving it.
Yeah, I think more of the latter. I mean, if you look at the kind of way that this entire investigation has played, it has now been, by the time Mueller comes up and testifies this week, 14 weeks since his report was released to the public, 18 weeks since he finished the investigation. And we're finally seeing the special counsel. It's the day before Congress leaves on a 6-week recess. When they get back, they're only in session a couple of months. It's hard to see impeachment happening in 2020 when you're in the midst of, when the country's in the midst of a conversation about who the next president ought to be, if it's someone other than Donald Trump. And so for this hearing to kickstart kind of this, if you were looking at this hearing as a way to kickstart momentum for impeachment, you would want it to be followed up with other hearings that would shine a light on the president's behavior. But we're not going to see Don McGahn anytime soon. It's been several months since he blew off the subpoena for him to come testify. They're just now going to court. It will take many more months to resolve it. I think it's likely that it's resolved if at all before the election, sometime in the fall of 2020, when those hearings will be largely a sideshow to the presidential election. So I think we ought to look at this hearing on Wednesday not as the kickstart for impeachment, but as a chance for the Congress to show the American people just what it is the president did during his campaign and just what he did in office, and the American people can decide for themselves whether they think that's appropriate behavior or not.
Then, Joyce, if it's going to be many months if and when we see Don McGahn testify, Hope Hicks is not looking to testify, nor is Don McGahn's deputy. That being the case, if the clock is on the president's side, not Democrats' side, what are they to do?
Well, Democrats have to make a decision about how serious they are about pursuing these matters in court and whether they can craft a narrative that explains to the American public how unusual it is to have people ducking subpoenas. If they don't have the witnesses available, and I think Matt is right that the clock continues to run and it doesn't run in Democrats' favor, then they will have to explain to people why this behavior by the president is so unseemly, so indicative of an effort to cover up wrongdoing, and they have not been successful in doing that to date. It is a significant challenge that they face because the president is so good at running the clock and behaving in ways that previously would have been unacceptable and damaging to a president.
There's a difference between unseemly and a cover-up. Unseemly, the president and theoretically his voters are okay with. They knew that unseemly was what they were voting for. A cover-up is something entirely different.
It is, and I think that's the important point here, Stephanie, because there are actions that the president may have taken for political reasons. He didn't want, for instance, voters to know that he was engaged in a deal with Russia in the late stages of the campaign. But the question becomes whether or not that was criminal behavior. As you point out, at least in his base, people are satisfied that what would have previously been politically unacceptable is, at least for this president, tolerable behavior. And that's why Democrats have such a heavy lift here. The rules are different for this president.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.